Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Now, the leaders of the G20 countries have held 7 summits to date, enough to begin to critically evaluate how well the G20 serves the interests of specific subparts of the international community. In Political Exchange tonight, we take a look at just how it has responded to the interests of the African continent. Joining me in studio is Sanusha Naidu, a senior researcher at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa. Sanusha, thank you so much for joining us. Now, your organization commissioned a research brief into whether the G20 is responsive to the interests of African countries. What informed your decision to commission this brief?
Good evening, Karima, and to your viewers. The reason we commissioned the piece was we were very interested in understanding the role that South Africa plays, and more importantly, the kind of African agenda that actually unfolds at the G20, particularly because South Africa is the only African country that is a member of the G20, and more importantly, whether or not South Africa's agenda actually represents the African interests and the broader African context in terms of the issues that affect the African political landscape in terms of economic, social, economic, and so forth. So that was part of the reason that we actually commissioned the brief. But also, I think what we have done subsequently is that we've had a roundtable discussion with Dr. Alan Hirsch from the presidency in South Africa, who is the Swiss Sherpa on the G20 for the South African government. And we also tried to unpack that at that discussion.
Now, tell me, the fact that South Africa is the only African country represented at the G20 takes us to the heart of the question of underrepresentation of Africa in that forum. From where you're sitting, Sanusha, are other African countries satisfied that South Africa is adequately representing this African agenda?
I think that is really the thrust of the debate right now in terms of an expanded membership for the African continent, and in particular the criteria that is used in terms of membership to the G20. What we found very interesting, both in terms of the commissioned commentary as well as the G20 forum that we hosted a few weeks ago, was that the African Union is represented, is a kind of standing invitation to the African Union to attend the G20 forum, as well as the NEPAD Secretariat. Now, obviously, the G20 and whichever is the hosting nation and becomes the kind of chair of the G20 on a rotational basis, they actually see this as a kind of broad representation of the African continent, and I think they use that as a kind of platform through which Africa gets an expanded voice. But it was very interesting in terms of other countries that perhaps may have interesting economic data, interesting economic performance, who may also be knocking on the door of the G20. And one of the issues that were raised at this forum that we hosted a few weeks ago were the questions around perhaps, will we see, for example, a Nigeria, a Rwanda, or perhaps another country who may actually be more in terms of its economic performance. I wouldn't say outperforming South Africa in terms of economic data, but actually have better data that comes out, and will they actually consider that as a possibility to get membership? And of course, the response from Dr. Alan Hirsch and from others on the panel was that not necessarily so. You know, we may not necessarily see an expanded membership, but right now I think even the G20 is trying to find its feet. I think at the last summit in Mexico, there was a lot of questions being raised about the dominance of the Eurozone crisis rather, and particularly the kinds of issues that were coming out then, whether the G20 is going to move forward in terms of the kinds of economic reform and the financial reform that we want to see happen in terms of trying to restructure the international financial architecture.
Now, in your study, what was the criteria for evaluating the G20?
Well, what we tried to do is, it wasn't really a study, it was more of a commentary to start thinking about the issues around the G20. I think, you know, very often when we think of the G20, we see it as this kind of broad grouping that somehow tends to swallow up the G8. For a long time, there were questions around whether the G7 or the G8 rather would remain as an independent and the G20 becomes the more expanded body. What we were also very interested in understanding from the commentary was to try and extract a sense of where this global architecture, the governance structures, how do we interpret a kind of global governance framework around the G20, the role that the G20 plays. Because I think if we go back and cast our minds to how the G20 emerged, it was really around the 2008 financial crisis. It was spearheaded by the former Canadian Prime Minister, Paul Martin, and in many ways it became a kind of expanded body where it started to look very critically at how to basically start addressing the financial crisis that was engulfing the international system and continues to do so, but more importantly around how does it actually then bring in rising powers from the South to also be part and parcel of the dialogue and in going forward around a global financial architecture that tries to identify the kinds of issues that were emerging around the financial crisis, but also to try and develop perhaps an early warning system maybe, but also to try and address some of these issues in terms of the contagion effects that it has for the financial markets and the global economy. And I think that was more or less why we were interested as well, in addition to the fact that Africa is represented, but the question is, what is the role of South Africa in this whole process? How does it push the African agenda? And how do other African countries see this?
Now, how does the brief go about defining African interests, particularly given the fact that we move from such different bases on the African continent?
Well, you see, that's an interesting point about the brief. The brief actually sets out the kinds of, it's a working brief in a sense where it sets out the structure of the G20, the role that the G20 plays, the kinds of emphasis that the G20 has, the agenda, etc. And in terms of the African interests, I think it's still very much based on a work in progress. I think that we cannot necessarily define the African interest as this and that. I think more broadly speaking, when we look at the role that South Africa plays and the kind in terms of being one of the co-chairs of the development working group within the G20, where some of the ideas around a kind of post MDG development period starts to emerge about what kind of development agenda we want to set. I think there's serious questions that we have. I think the brief really is around raising more questions for us to take forward as areas of inquiry in terms of the African interest. I think if we look at, for example, regions in the continent, we look at East Africa, West Africa, parts of Central Africa, and of course now I think, well, how do we actually also engage in the context of North Africa in the sense of what has happened as a kind of post-Arab Spring phase. I think we have to start asking the questions of the interest that Africa has within the G20, because there's a lot of that we have to start thinking about, not necessarily as homogeneous, but as a kind of heterogeneous set of interests that begin to emerge. And I think this is really around the governance of the G20. Where do we see the G20 going in the future? But more importantly, I think, what do we think the agenda of the G20 will be, and how will the membership start to evolve?
Now, we've seen in recent weeks and months that the South African Home Affairs Minister, Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, was elected as the AU Commission Chair. Do you think that this development is going to assist in getting a broader African perspective and ensure that South Africa actually does take African interests to the G20? Or do you think that it could be interpreted as South African dominant to the exclusion of the interests of other important states on the continent?
Mm-hmm. I think that's very much a very important and significant issue that has emerged subsequent to Mrs. Zuma's election as the AU Commission chairperson. What's very interesting about that is that there's still very much two debates out there, as you rightly pointed out. Will this give greater coherence and congruence to the kinds of issues South Africa wants to pursue and take into that agenda and reflect the interests of the broader African mandate? And what is that broader African mandate? And of course, at the other end of the spectrum is the question around, well, is this about pursuing South Africa's interests more narrowly, and how will that actually then necessarily align to the African agenda? And I think this is very much where South Africa has come in and said, well, we see this as basically aligning, joining the dots more or less around the African agenda that has been the kind of anchor to South Africa's foreign policy for in the white paper and in subsequent documents and policy documents that have emerged from DIRCO. What I also find very interesting is that I think there's definitely a sense out there among certain sectors and certain quarters in the African continent that perhaps this may not necessarily be about the African agenda, but it may actually be about South Africa's interests in terms of this. I think what we would like to see is a much more clearer perspective, a much more broader coherence and alignment to how Mrs. Zuma is going to work with the various agencies, the various institutions within the African Union to align to the kind of agenda that South Africa somehow puts out as its interest in terms of being part of these multilateral fora like the G20, like the UN, etc. And I think this is perhaps where much of her work needs to be cut out in terms of the framework she sets out, not necessarily a broad framework, but try to identify the areas where the alignment will take place.
Now, when she was appointed, in her very first maiden speech, she made it very clear that she's not there representing narrow South African interests, that she is representing the interests of the continent. But of course, that came off the back of a very bitter contest for that post. Do you think that her attempt to reassure other African countries that she is going to take the issues on board, did it resonate sufficiently for that view to be cemented, or do you think she's going to still have to do quite a bit of work to get over that kind of the effects of that bitter contest that we saw recently?
Well, I think it's the latter. I think that there's a lot of residual issues around the way in which the race for the position had unfolded from Addis in January, the stalemate that emerged, the subsequent lobbying, the kinds of issues that emerged with regard to that, and then of course the way it all actually unfolded in Addis again in June. I think essentially there's a lot of trust and confidence that she needs to build and try to strengthen those relationships in order to actually give a lot of substance to her maiden speech, where she said it's not South Africa that will occupy the position of the AU Commission chair, but it's rather me representing the African continent. I think that is where the trust and the confidence needs to come in. There's still those hangover effects of what happened in Addis. There's still questions about whether she's still a credible candidate, whether it's about South Africa trying to punch above its weight, etc. So I think in many ways it's about what she maps out when she gets to Addis in the next couple of weeks, how she builds those areas of relationships, and how she works with the agencies and the programs within the African Union, which for quite a few months have been left kind of limping along because they haven't been able to fill those positions from Addis in January. So I think it's about setting out the agenda and building the confidence, working with the bureaucracy as well. That will be quite a different set of issues, a different set of environment, a different cultural setting as well that Mrs. Zuma has to get used to.
Well, we're taking a short break now, but when we return, we continue our conversation with Sanusha Naidu, a senior researcher at the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, on just how the G20 is responding to the needs of Africa.